Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach. Our story begins in 1972 in a beautiful upscale neighborhood of East Hampton, New York, just a stone's throw away from the beach, which is adorned with vacation homes and Victorian mansions. Many of these houses are home to New York City's elite, and they have been their vacation homes for their families for generations. But there is one house that stands out amongst them all, a 28-room sprawling estate which has earned the moniker Grey Gardens because of the color of the dunes, the concrete garden walls, and the sea mist. This house, while initially beautiful, has been neglected for decades and has fallen into an unfortunate state of disrepair. Overgrown trees and bushes obscure the view of this once impressive mansion, and inside it is only worse. Mountains of garbage adorn the hallways, while feral cats and raccoons inhabit the rooms and the attic. Fleas have infested the home, which no longer has access to running water, heat, or electricity. Neighbors who are fed up with the local eyesore have filed a petition with the local township to have the property condemned. But the home's tenants claim that they are being harassed by political rivals of their family. And just who are these tenants, and who is their family? Well, Grey Gardens is inhabited by a mother and a daughter, both named Edie, both who stem from upper-class New York society. The mother, Big Edie as she is called, was born to the extravagant Bouvier family, and she is the aunt to former First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Her daughter, Little Edie, was a former socialite, fashion model, and cabaret performer, and she had a lavish upbringing as part of America's Catholic aristocracy. Now, in 1972, this pair live in almost near isolation and squalor, but it's worth noting that in their heyday, they were prominent New York royalty. For instance, when Big Edie married her husband, Phelan Beale, a prominent lawyer and financier, it was the social event of 1917. Their lavish wedding at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan drew out all of New York City's socialites and was attended by the mayor and the governor. Later, when their only daughter, Little Edie, was presented to society as a debutante on New Year's Eve in 1936 at the Pierre Hotel, the New York Times reported on the event, writing, quote, Edie wore a gown of white net appliqued in silver with a wreath of gardenias in her hair. Now, knowing all of this, one could easily ask, what happened to these women? What could induce such a fall from grace and land them living in near abject poverty in a once beautiful home that is now collapsing all around them? Well, after years of arguments and supposed infidelity, Big Edie and her husband Phelan separated in 1947, and he left her Grey Gardens with just a very modest allowance. It certainly was not enough to keep up with the demand of maintaining a 28-bedroom beachfront estate. Big Edie could have easily sold the mansion and lived indefinitely off the profits, but she chose to stay in the home by herself, perhaps to remind her of the happier times in life she once had. Little Edie, while seemingly having infinite possibilities as a Macy's fashion model, chose not to marry, although it is reported that she dated John Paul Getty, the oil baron, and Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Little Edie moved back to Grey Gardens in 1952 to take care of her mother, and for the next 20 years, these women had very little contact with the outside world besides the occasional reporter or curious onlooker. By the time we catch up with them in 1972, they are eating simple canned foods and slices of bread, which are oftentimes poached by the raccoons living in the walls. Now, I'd like to take a pause in this story and pivot to another tale of two women. And this story we'll read tomorrow morning, as we do every Shavuot, the biblical story of Ruth. Now, at first glance, the book of Ruth could not seem more different than the strange and tragic world of Great Gardens. One story takes place in the Hamptons of the 1970s, the other in the fields of ancient Bethlehem. But at their core, both stories ask the very same question. What happens to two women after the collapse of the world they once knew? The book of Ruth begins not with triumph, but with catastrophe. We're told a famine has struck the land of Judah, and a woman named Naomi leaves her homeland with her husband and two sons in search of survival. But while living abroad in Moab, Naomi's husband dies, and then one by one, all of her sons die. Naomi is left with only her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Three widows, three vulnerable women with no clear future in a world where survival depended almost entirely upon male protection and inheritance. Naomi tells the young women to leave her, to return to their families and begin again. And Orpah does just that, but Ruth, she refuses. And that's when she utters those now immortal words, quote, "Where you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." It is one of the most beautiful declarations of loyalty in all of human literature, in my opinion. But if we listen carefully, it is also something else. A declaration of radical dependency. Ruth binds her fate entirely to Naomi. Two women alone after social collapse. Two widows with no money, no husbands, no status, and no certainty of tomorrow. And in that sense, Ruth and Naomi begin to resemble Big Edie and Little Edie. Two women living amidst the ruins of a former life. One older, one younger. One clinging to memory, the other sacrificing her own future out of devotion and obligation. Like Naomi, Big Edie remains in the house long after the life that once animated it has disappeared, perhaps because leaving it behind would mean acknowledging that the world she loved was truly gone. And like Ruth, Little Edie gives up possibility for companionship. She leaves behind New York society, fashion, performance, and romance, only to care for her aging mother in an isolated and deteriorating home. Now, of course, there are differences between these stories. The book of Ruth ultimately bends toward redemption, and Great Gardens often feels trapped in stasis. But there is a moment in 1972 that changes our story, a moment that I think speaks directly to the meaning of Shavuot. When the Suffolk County Board of Health threatened to evict the Edies and condemn Great Gardens entirely, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis stepped in. Jackie, the niece of Big Edie and cousin of Little Edie, provided the money needed to repair the home, to remove the garbage, restore the utilities, and make the house livable again. And what strikes me so deeply about this is the house was not saved by independence. Rather, it was saved by relationship. Someone remembered these two women. Someone claimed responsibility for them. Someone said, "You are still a part of us." And that, my friends, perhaps is the deepest message of Shavuot. When we think about this holiday, we oftentimes think about revelation at Mount Sinai, thunder, lightning, of course, the Ten Commandments. But the book of Ruth reminds us that Torah is not revealed only in grand miracles. Torah is revealed in acts of loyalty to those we love, in the feeding of the hungry, in refusing abandonment, and accompanying another person through their grief. The rabbis teach that Ruth is read on Shavuot because her acceptance of Naomi's people mirrors our acceptance of Torah at Mount Sinai. But perhaps it is even more intimate than that, because covenant is not merely a contract between humanity and God. Covenant is the refusal to let another person disappear. At Sinai, we did not stand alone. We stood together, the young and the old, the stranger and the native, the vulnerable and the secure. And that is why the book of Ruth ends not in isolation, but in community. The women are restored to Bethlehem. Ruth gleans in Boaz's fields. Neighbors bless Naomi, and a child is born, and a future becomes imaginable again. Grey Garden shows us what can happen when isolation calcifies, when grief becomes a house that we cannot leave. But Ruth teaches that redemption begins the moment another human being says, I will not leave you behind. On this Shavuot, in a world where so many people feel isolated, where so many quietly live amidst unseen forms of collapse, the story of Ruth reminds us that holiness begins with accompaniment. Not grand gestures, not perfect theology, but the sacred act of remaining with one another, even amongst the ruins. Friends, may we cling to each other like Ruth did to Naomi. May we love each other in the good times, the bad times, and even the raccoon times. Shabbat Shalom.